Hi, this is our third video for this initial portion of content on the course of the Pentateuch. We now move on to Genesis chapter 2, the other creation account. If you want to just draw a parallel between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, Genesis 2 is more of an anthropological creation account, meaning that Genesis 2's main concern is to evaluate the creation of mankind and the relationship that mankind had with God. Whereas Genesis 1 is a cosmological creation account, being given from the standpoint or from the viewpoint of God and concerning the created order as a whole, despite the fact that the language around the creation of mankind is different than the other created beings and realms. It's still a very cosmic view of that. There's just the two verses that talks about man and female being created in God's image and likeness. And so it's still cosmological in focus. Genesis 2 now really narrows down on humanity, and even talks about how Eden or how creation was at this point in time before the fall. Reviewing again the reason why we have the two creation accounts, we must remember that most likely Genesis 2, due to its concern with Adam and Eve and their life in the garden leading up to Genesis 3 when they fell and they were expelled, probably was the earlier account. It was probably the one handed down from the Mosaic tradition. Genesis 1 was a later addition by a priestly school where poetically they wanted to introduce creation in a way that will set a contrast between the creation account from Yahweh and the myths that they had encountered in Babylon. And it was, some have written that it's almost like an apologetic, or it serves an apologetic purpose to counter the different myths of Babylonian religion. And so it might have come around the time of the exile or coming out of the exile. But moving on, we see in Genesis 2 that there are three aspects of life in Eden that we encounter. We see humanity's role in creation. The creation of humanity in Genesis 2, it's very straightforward. But when it comes to explaining the role that how Adam and subsequently Adam and Eve related to the rest of creation, it becomes more granular. Number 2 is humanity's responsibility in the home. So in a way, it does give us a little bit of a preview of what God's plan for the family is. And number 3, how humanity relates with God. And obviously this is the perfect context to then talk about how that relationship was broken. We cannot fully grasp the consequences of the fall without understanding what we lost as a human race in that fall. So let's tackle the first one, the role of humanity in creation. The most direct reference to this is that God gives a charge for them to multiply and subdue the earth. And so the word subdue here has been the focus of many, many debates. And obviously some later translations or more recent translations of the Bible might not use the word subdue. But in the King James understanding of the word, there is an authoritarian dynamic to this word. When you look at the Hebrew, which is kabash, indeed there is a domination. So subduing is not necessarily incorrect. God is giving mankind authority to exercise rule over creation. However, again, one building block leads to the other. Remember that mankind is created in the image and likeness of God. Basically, what God was to the first human beings, the first human beings was to be to the rest of creation. And thus it involves a sense of authority and mastery. However, God's authority did not manifest in a despotic, oppressive way. And so what we have in here is maybe more of a relational, functional connection, considering that the word denotes human relationships, because later on, kabash will be used to explain or describe a master having authority over a higher servant. This dominion that is linked to the word subdue or kabash in the original language is a dominion out of care. So when Adam and Eve are given mastery over the rest of the animals, the rest of the creatures, it's not a license for them to exploit the natural resources of the earth. It's a command to extend God's authority in the care and in the upkeep of the created order. Once again, what God was to the first human beings were called to be to the rest of creation. And so God will not look at us as creatures to be exploited. If in fact that was more of a theme in Babylonian creation stories, where humanity was made out of carcasses, and the gods will exercise their authority in a very capricious way upon humanity. It's not so with Yahweh. Yahweh cares for the human beings that he created in his image and likeness, and because they're created in the image and likeness, they can bring in a sense of order and rulership to the rest of the created order, but never done in a way where there is exploitation. It's important to know that, as in recent times we have thankfully seen a development of eco-theology, or a understanding of environmental issues through the lens of theology, and some of our long-held beliefs around that, which gave a free license to exploiting and not caring, or basically not caring about creation, are being revisited and reshaped in light of the creation story. It is told to us that there was work in Eden. A part of this subduing the earth meant the upkeep of the earth. And that's a very important concept that will be later on fleshed out in the fall. Because when you look at Genesis 2, it is clear that there was work involved in Eden. Work was not a product of the fall. Now, it was the way Adam worked that changed after the fall. Because Genesis 2 tells us a little bit about how the environment was. the fact that there was water coming up from the ground in forms of mists. In other words, Adam indeed had to do some work and plant the gardens and keep up with the different trees, but he didn't have a toilsome work dynamic because the irrigation was provided for. The work that we have in Genesis 2 is one where there is 100% success involved in the work, meaning that there was no famines, there was no environmental conditions that would have meant that a tree wouldn't produce fruit. Basically, everything was provided for, but Adam still had to do his part and cultivate and just make sure that things are taken care of. The next layer in this relationship between humanity and creation is that, and this is again, we see an extension of how God treated humanity, and now humanity treats the other created beings. Adam is given the privilege to name the animals. And again, this shows that indeed mankind is above the other creatures. But here's the thing, once again, that is not a license for exploitation or animal cruelty. Because this is a way to say, as God named Adam, and Adam was allowed to name Eve, now Adam names the animal, the other animals, as a way, or as a I gotta reword that one. Naming the animals shows man's rule over the animal kingdom. But it shows it not in an but it shows it not in a despotic way. Because God, out of love and care, gave mankind names. Now mankind gives the animals their names. And by the way, we don't see God affecting Adam's decisions here. We see that God allows him to do this part as a show or as a proof of his position as a higher created being. This shows that this role was really about caring over creation. When you name something, there is a parental dynamic to that relationship. You name a child, you name a pet that you care about, there is a parental layer and connection to that relationship, and that's how we should see this portion of Genesis 2. Even in the ancient Hebrew context, naming the child wasn't just about finding the coolest sounding name, it was about pronouncing a blessing. And so Adam naming the animals is an extension whereby God, through humanity, pronounces blessings on the created order. It's a very, very interesting concept. Humanity's relationship with God. We are told, as Genesis 2 comes to a close, that God walked with Adam and Eve in the cool of the day. Again, this is an anthropological creation account that highlights the relationship between God and humanity. As brief as that statement is, what we're being told is that God personally leads mankind into its destiny, into its home, and into its joy. What we had in Eden in Genesis 2 wasn't a distant relationship. And the creation account is making that clear. Within this relationship, we can see a few concepts. There is purpose. In fact, Genesis 2a shows in the description of the garden how the different rivers flow out of it, how the mist will come out of the earth to ensure irrigation of crops and trees. We see that God prepares the garden. There is purpose in that relationship. It even says that he put Adam in it. And again, the verbiage there is a very personal verbiage being used. The choice of words are certainly seem intentional to flesh this out, that this is a purpose, a divine and wise purpose being crafted. The garden is prepared the way it is. Adam, as representative of humanity, is placed in it in that way, and everything is done for the purpose of making that created order beautiful. We see compassion, because when Adam feels his own loneliness, seeing the animals pair 2 by 2, and coming to the conclusion that he is alone, it is God that says it is not good for man to be alone. And that is a moment where there is compassion, where a human need moves God to do a miracle. The creation of Eve, the creation of the woman whom he will take as his wife. We also see companionship. God walked with them. In fact, this will actually be stated in Genesis 3 as the fall had already happened, to allow us to reflect that what they had lost was this deep sense of close intimacy with God. And again, this will draw a very heavy contrast to the idea of gods and mankind in the religions that surrounded the Israelites. God walking with them certainly was a unique thing. So companionship. Generosity, because God gave them everything that they needed. In fact, the corruption of God's words led to a corruption of God's character in the eyes of Adam and Eve. And what we see in Genesis 2 is that he gave them everything. God gave them everything they needed to survive and thrive. And then responsibility. So in that same breath, there is the generosity of God, but there is an expectation of responsibility when God sets limits for the sake of humanity. And this is a quintessential conversation as it relates to our expectation to be obedient to God. The commandments are not restrictions of life, but they do set limits that are necessary for us so that life as designed by God could be fully enjoyed by us. Moving on, the responsibility of humanity in the home. We must bring back Genesis 1:27. In that both men and women bear the image of God. There is a defined difference, indeed. Man and woman, he created them. The gender difference, the gender duality is clear. But both genders on their own right reflect the fullness of God's character. So before the fall, there is no hierarchy. Adam's leadership was rooted on the fact that he was able to communicate the commandment that he had received directly from God. More of this will come down in the fall. But at this point, we don't see a hierarchy. Adam is created first, and Eve is created after. And most likely, at least in Genesis 2, there is not a moment when God directly tells Eve about being able to eat from every tree except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We must assume that Adam, having received this commandment previously, was tasked to teach that to Eve. However, this is all rooted on the fact that he received that commandment before Eve comes into existence. There is no hierarchy. Even when God says that he will create Eve as and this is where, again, translations are going to come up with different ways of expressing this Hebrew expression. Suitable helper is probably the one related or one connected with the older translations of the Bible. In Hebrew is Ezer Kenegdo. Ezer is a particular concept because it means help or helper, but Ezer throughout the Old Testament is used to refer to God coming to help Israel in a life-threatening situation. So when it says God is our helper or God is our help, it's not our helper as in, hey, I just need a little favor and you're coming alongside to help me, but there are no high stakes on that little favor that I just asked you. That Ezer means helper as in rescuer, savior almost, coming in to extend or to preserve life. And that's a very, very important connection. In other words, the man was going to need the woman, and vice versa. Genesis elevates women to a place of honor in creation. When you look down to all of this, how she was created, how she's brought to Adam, how she's referred to as the Ezer Kenegdo, as the helper, as the rescuer, it places a lot of honor on women, which was absent in Canaanite religions, which devalue women as sex objects for childbearing and men's pleasure. And thus there were female priestess in some of these Canaanite temples, because the idea of womanhood was there to please the men's desire. But Genesis 1 and 2 combined places a very high value on womanhood. Now there is the commandment to multiply. There is the words that they will become one flesh. Indeed, at this point before the fall, there is already a design on the family, man and woman coming together. But that coming of together will not just be a physical coming together to become one flesh in the sexual relationship, but it will be also an emotional and spiritual connection between the man and the woman. Thus, many generations later, God uses the analogy of the husband and the wife to describe his own relationship to Israel. And so Genesis 2 elevates the place of womanhood, elevates also the place of the family. It elevates the place of the conjugal relationship to be a means not just for the pleasure of each, the man and the woman in marriage, but also for the benefit of creating and bringing forth life to populate and enjoy the world that God has created. And so we see intimacy in God's relationship with humanity. We see a care in the human's relationship with the created order. We see equality in the home relationship, in the family relationship between the woman and the man and the woman. And thus, this will complete our content on creation. What we see looking at 1 and 2 is an orderly, beautiful, perfect creation where everything is provided for, and yet there are limits being set upon humanity, because otherwise we wouldn't have a choice but to follow God. It reflects about God's character that as creator as he is, he did not create humanity. Part of pursuing a loving relationship with humanity was to at least make available the option of choosing against God, so that humanity's faithfulness to God was a choice and not forced upon them. In this world, there's different theories about will they die, will they not. That's when the tree of life comes in later on. Traditionally, it's been held that at this point there is no death, physical death, and spiritual death. Other theories suggest that there might be physical death, but not in the sense of evil, so it being caused by disease or a crime, but eventually after many centuries they would have died. And that's why he kept them from eating the tree of life, because if they would have eaten the tree of life, they would have stayed like they are forever. Different theories that come into play when we talk about Genesis 3. However, we see a world of harmony, a world of equality, a world in which they were supposed to have children and enjoy that. It is unclear. I know that Genesis 4 talks about Adam knowing Eve, and it kind of gets the hint that that's the first time they copulated and Abel was born, or Abel was conceived. But it is unclear that at this point in time they already had children. We're not told about that, other than the fact that they were to populate the earth and they were to become one flesh as husband and wife. And so that concludes our discussion on Genesis 1 and 2, the creation account. Thank you.